coming. It's my honor to introduce Carrico. She's a research assistant professor at Vanderbilt University in the Institute for Energy and Environment. She's a PhD in social psychology from Vanderbilt in 2009. Her dissertation was Motivating Pro-Environmental Behavior, an intervention to promote electricity conservation in an organizational setting. Amanda's been involved in a number of different research projects. One of the most recent one is a $3.7 million NSF grant, which she's a co-PI on, from the Water Sustainability and Climate Group. The title is Climate, Drought, and Agricultural Adaptations, an investigation of vulnerabilities and response to water stress among paddy farmers in Sri Lanka. And a number of her projects are overseas. Another one she's working on, the Office of Naval Research, is studying various small communities in Bangladesh, and there's another one on grasses and gases. She's got a very impressive bibliography, and I encourage you to look at the CV, which has been sent around. And before I describe the articles and then turn it over to her, I want to say please do fill out the evaluation forms. There are a couple here on the table. They can also be sent to you by email. The search committee really needs, values your feedback. Amanda's published a number of different journals, the International Journal of Consumer Studies, the Environment and Behavior Journal, the Journal of Environmental Psychology, and the Journal of Energy and Environmental Law. She's also published with a number of big names in this area. Paul Stern, some of you may know, he's a person who kept funding going for behavioral science for many, many decades. Jerry Gardner, who's one of our own people at the University of Michigan at Dearborn, environmental psychologist, and Tom Dietz from that other school down the road. So without further ado, let me introduce.
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. Thanks everyone for coming. I've already had a chance to talk with a few of you this morning, and I look forward to talking with more of you, of course, the next day. So thanks for having me. The specific project I'll be talking about today involves an investigation into the neighborhood and household level predictors of long-term hazard use. And I'll talk a little bit about that cover title in just a minute to give you an idea about what we're actually looking at. But before I get into the work, I'd like to take a second to sort of back up, talk a little bit about who I am as a researcher and how this particular project fits into my larger body of work. So as you just heard, my background is in social psychology. I received my PhD from the traditional psychology department at Vanderbilt, and then moved into a postdoctoral fellowship at the Vanderbilt Institute for Energy and Environment. That's VIE. And VIE has a fairly broad participation across the university from a number of different disciplines. We have participants from both the physical and social sciences. And so via this position, I've had the luxury of collaborating with a number of individuals across these different backgrounds, and I've really come, I think, to identify myself as an interdisciplinary environmental social science researcher. And you've heard some of the journals that I'm publishing, so I'm kind of reaching out a little bit beyond my own traditional disciplinary outlets. So the starting point for much of my work and for the work that I'll be talking about today involves attempting to understand what the psychological and social factors are that motivate pro-environmental behavior. Well, I should actually say environmentally significant behavior. So this includes both behaviors that have a direct impact on the environment, as well as how individuals respond behaviorally to environmental change. And this latter instance of behavior is a sort of new line of work that I've been developing, where we're looking at adaptation to environmental change in a few different contexts, both in the developing world context. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. So I see my work attempting to inform the identification of behavioral targets. So this includes not only which behaviors are the most impactful in terms of their outcomes in the environment, but also which ones are the most changeable. So in some cases, the fact that behaviors are very resistant to change means that even though they're very impactful, they're not very good candidates for outreach and policy targets. So I'm considering both the impactfulness of behavior, but also the plasticity of the behavior. And I'm also looking to understand what the design features are of policies and programs in terms of their effectiveness in motivating behavior change. So to give you a little bit more information about some of the work I've been doing, some of you may be familiar with the work, a paper by Dietz et al. That came out a few years ago, in which they proposed a behavioral wedge, which constituted a set of individual and household actions to reduce carbon emissions. So this work draws on an earlier paper by Carrico and Sokolow, which some of you may be familiar with, in which they're essentially looking at the difference between the business as usual trajectory for carbon emissions and what it would take to level off carbon emissions at 2004 level, which is where this paper came out. And that difference between the flat cap and the business as usual trajectory is a stabilization triangle. And they essentially propose segmenting that up into 7 or 8 different wedges, each of which has a sort of little different policy angle And they propose about 15 or so wedges to get us to that flat path goal over the course of 50 years. And some of the wedges they propose involve building out nuclear energy, deforestation programs, as well as some conservation efficiency. But primarily they are focusing on technical efficiency, improving the vehicle fleet, setting compliance standards. Dietz et al. Came along and proposed a wedge that involved specifically targeting behavior. So home weatherization, driving behavior, improving public transportation infrastructure. And their wedge constituted 123 million metric tons over 10 years, which is roughly about 7% of total U.S. emissions. So my own work follows within this line, and I'm looking at understanding what the specific behavioral targets could be for achieving the behavioral wedge. So in one set of studies, I've looked at the role of information deficits in driving up energy use. So in particular, for example, the work on motor vehicle idling, I've looked at misperceptions about how long you should let your vehicle idle. I found that around 80% of the population in this country has wildly inaccurate beliefs about how long you should idle your vehicle, both for your own economic well-being as well as to improve the environment. Does anyone know what the actual recommendation is for idling? 30 seconds. 30 seconds. Very good. Very good. Oh, yeah. So people estimates range between 2.5 to 4.5 minutes. So much higher than what the actual recommendations are. And we found that this unnecessary idling, which is largely driven by these misperceptions, accounts for a fairly substantial amount of carbon dioxide emissions. Now, 16.3 million metric tons is not large in terms of the total national emissions, but it is larger than a number of industrial sources of emissions, and it's larger than the total annual emissions from a number of small countries, including our neighbor Jamaica. So our sort of approach in this paper is to suggest, hey, here's the sort of low-hanging fruit of emissions that are out there that could be potentially easily changeable, given the fact that they're largely driven by inaccurate beliefs. So in some other work that I've done, I've attempted to look at how do we actually motivate behavior change. So my dissertation, as you just heard, involved a randomized and controlled experiment that looked at 4 different approaches at messaging and how they affected energy conservation behavior. I've also done some work to synthesize these literatures and to propose how they could be incorporated into law and policy frameworks. And I'm happy to talk about more specifics of any of these different projects at the end. Okay, so that represents much of my completed work. Let me now talk a little bit about sort of where I'm going. I have a number of projects that are at early stages in development or sort of getting ramped up. One is the one I'll talk about today, which is looking at household fertilizer application. And I should stop and say, I think that the line of projects that sort of are representing my future work, one of the qualities is that they're taking on a much more interdisciplinary focus. And I think I've really sort of broadened the scope a little bit about the sorts of behaviors that I'm looking at and the implications of those behaviors. So one involves looking at fertilizer usage among households. I also have a couple of projects that are getting going that are looking at behavioral responses to environmental change. So this work is developing in Sri Lanka. We were just funded by the NSF to look at how paddy farmers are responding to increasing water scarcity, both due to meteorological drought as well as to water allocation decisions that are being made throughout this particular irrigation system in Sri Lanka. So this is a very diverse team. We're corners on PIs and hydrologists. We also have participation from sociology, work in environmental sciences, engineering, and psychologists. We have a similar project in Bangladesh in which we're looking at how people are adapting livelihoods in response to growing salinity problems and flooding, and particularly how these adaptations relate to decisions to move out of these rural areas into urban centers. We'll begin doing survey work in Bangladesh in March to start looking at the patterns of migration. And then finally, I have a very early stage project that's taken on a much more disciplinary specific question, but one that I think is really fundamental to a lot of the work that I'm doing, which is to understand under what conditions a decision to adopt a pro-environmental behavior, green behavior, leads to moral licensing effects, where people are less likely to adopt, to do more green things in the future, versus more sustainable lifestyle changes. And so I had a grant under review with Uncle Weber and some colleagues at Vanderbilt to look at this specific question using both experimental design and surveys. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in for the next little bit and talk about the first project there. And I selected this project not because it necessarily represents my most completed work, but I think it captures the sort of flavor of interdisciplinary work that I try to do in the next 5 to 10 years. I wanted to be a little bit more depth about the kind of work that I'm doing, so the methodologies I'm using, and the analytical approaches that I'm taking. Okay, so this work involves fertilization usage in households. We chose the lawn as a setting for this study for a number of different reasons. First, unbeknownst to a lot of people, turf grass cultivation is actually the single largest crop in the United States. It's actually 3 times larger than the corn crop. So it's just a pervasive image throughout the landscape. It's primarily concentrated, as you know, in urban areas, and urban areas are expanding at a very quick rate. They've quadrupled over the last 50 years, and they're growing at nearly twice the rate of the population. So much of the reason for this heavy expansion has to do with growing lot size as much of it is devoted to lawn space. A number of scholars have looked at the ecological impacts of lawns, and we know that they're not all negative. There are some benefits of lawn cultivation. They serve as turf grass can sequester carbon, and they also serve as to filter water in urban environments that tend to be dominated by impervious surfaces. However, the specific dark green, lush monoculture lawn, like the picture you see here, is very difficult to obtain without significant energy, water, and chemical inputs. And so it's really how lawns are managed at the household level that determines how impactful they actually are, much more so than the actual farm choice itself. So the specific behavior I'm looking at in this study is fertilizer usage. We know that on a per hectare basis, lawns tend to be much more chemically intensive even than agriculture. And in much of the country, specifically in the southeast region where this work takes place, we also know that the amount of fertilizer that's applied to lawns tend to be much greater than what the plants actually need to sustain their growth. And so what happens is that much of that nitrogen ends up being leached out of the soil in the form of nitrate, which causes a number of negative environmental outcomes, including groundwater contamination, acidification, loss of soil nutrients, eutrophication, algal blooms. The local ecological impacts of fertilizer uses are profound, particularly in some areas such as the Chesapeake Bay area, the Baltimore area. There's a sister project going on there that is looking specifically at many of these impacts. An open question, however, is to what extent do lawns actually contribute to global warming? A natural byproduct of the nitrogen cycle is the release of nitrous oxide emissions. Nitrous oxide is a relatively small component of all greenhouse gas emissions. However, it's up to around 300 times more potent than carbon dioxide. And so for that reason, it's a target of mitigation. It tends to be, on average, the largest contributor of nitrous oxide is by far agriculture. However, there are a number of reasons to look to lawns as a potential meaningful source. This is both because of the size of the turf grass crop in this country, as well as the rate it's expanding, and what we know about how chemically intensive it actually is. So for these reasons, a few scholars have recently begun looking for lawns to determine, is this a source that we actually need to care about, and could this actually be a target for doing greenhouse gas mitigation? So while there's a number of reasons to be concerned about nitrogen application, the specific biophysical question I'll be looking at least as the topic of this project, will be lawns' contribution to nitrous oxide emissions, expectancies, and gases. So a number of people have also noted the significant social dimensions of lawn care management. Primarily, the work that's been done, at least up until the last 10 years or so, was looking at the more individualistic motivations, so ease of maintenance, aesthetic preferences, the obvious economic considerations of maintaining your property values. However, more recently, people have begun to discuss the significant social dimensions of these actions. So obviously, lawns are highly visibly clear, and the way you maintain your lawn affects not only your own well-being, property values, and enjoyment of your property, but also that of your neighbors. And it affects the neighborhood's social status as a whole. And so for these reasons, we would expect that lawn maintenance behaviors would be highly subject to a number of very intense social norms and expectations. So it's this particular piece of this project that I'll be sort of focusing in on today. Okay, so to orient you a little more towards the actual project, these data come from an interdisciplinary project in which we're looking at both the social and physical systems in tandem, whereas traditionally these systems have been looked at more in isolation. And so we're going to look at fertilizer application behavior as it relates to a number of different levels of social influence. So this includes household characteristics. I'll be looking at property values and income, individual attitudes and preferences. So how do environmental concerns factor into these sorts of decisions? How do personal aesthetic preferences factor into these decisions? Neighborhood level influences, so the expectation that others are fertilizing, perceives scrutiny and standards for what is acceptable in one's neighborhood. And I'll also look at one element of community governance, which is whether there's a homeowners association in the neighborhood. And we know that in many cases, HOAs dictate what lawn management regimes are are used in a neighborhood. In many cases, a certain lawn care provider is required as a condition of living in that neighborhood. So we're interested in whether that actually affects total nitrogen application of these households. And we're also looking at how these application behaviors influence the complex biophysical process that ultimately leads to nitrous oxide emissions, as well as leaching of nitrogen into the soil. And there are a number of additional lawn management practices that also affect this process and may drive up the total emissions that result at the end. I'm not going to talk about these today, but I'll just put them up here to show that there are additional considerations, behavioral considerations in this process as well. So I'm going to zoom in on the human system today and talk specifically about patterns of fertilizer application behavior, how these patterns relate to the various levels of social and individual and household level factors. And I'll talk a little bit about some preliminary data we have regarding the relationship between application behavior and nitrous oxide emissions. Okay, so this project is a 3-year NSF-funded study that was conducted within the Richmond Creek watershed. The Richmond Creek watershed is an urban watershed that exists within the metropolitan Nashville area. As I've already mentioned, we have a very interdisciplinary team, including psychologists, sociologists, law, policy, engineering. A number of our students are from engineering. Our data collection, at least what I'll talk about today, involved a set of household surveys as well as lawn emissions measurements that were used to calibrate a model that I'll talk a little bit more about later. So the Richmond Creek watershed is an urban watershed. Here it is here. This is the Davidson County area. And it extends from the Cumberland River, which is in the downtown concentrated area, out into the more suburban areas. It includes about 14,000 residential parcels and only around 2,000, 3,000 commercial parcels, so it's very much dominated by the neighborhood landscape. And one of the particularly good qualities of this watershed in terms of a research side, in addition to its obvious geographic proximity to our research team, is that it included a good distribution of low, middle, and high income families, and particularly as you sort of move from the central, more urban downtown Nashville area. So our sampling design involved a stratified cluster probability sampling. So what we did was to segment the watershed into 3 income groups, low, middle, and high. And then we randomly selected 20 face blocks, 20 neighborhoods from within those income groups for a total of 60 neighborhoods. And then once those neighborhoods were selected, we also randomly selected a single face block from within the neighborhood. And a face block is a set of 10 contiguous households and the 10 contiguous households directly across from it. So sampling at the face block level allowed us to really sort of capture those social dynamics that we think are influencing these behaviors. All 20 households on the face block, mostly 20, sometimes there were fewer than 20, were invited to participate in the survey. We ended up with 340 households who participated in 59 neighborhoods, and we achieved a 34% response rate, which is a little lower than, it's always lower than what you want. I'd say it's not atypical, this kind of work. Our interviews were all done face-to-face and lasted about an hour, so there was a significant time investment in this. So the 34% is not low for this kind of work, although it does cause us to be concerned about that limitation of the sampling design. Okay, so I'll quickly walk through the constructs that we mentioned. I'm happy again to talk more about this later on in terms of the skill development that we did behind this. So we look at household characteristics, and I include a measure of property value, home ownership, and whether there are children or pets within the house that may trigger concern about exposure to chemicals. I look at lawn care importance, how concerned are you about the lawn and how much you desire that particular green aesthetic. I'll look at a measure of environmental concern, chemical concern, so that is how much you think chemicals affect you personally. I'll look at some additional household level variables that were measured at the household level, but that get at this perception of how your neighbors influence your behavior. So I include a measure of perceived neighborhood norm. So within the psychology literature, the specific norm I'm talking about is a descriptive norm. That is, how typical is this behavior within your social environment. And then a measure of what I'm calling perceived neighborhood scrutiny. How much do your neighbors keep a close watch on your lawn? Do you think there are certain expectations about how the lawn should be managed in this neighborhood? And then finally, I'm including some neighborhood level characteristics. So I put a measure that I call neighborhood standards. So this is the perception within the neighborhood of whether parcels should be kept to a similar standard, then aggregated up to the block level. So it's the amount of agreement at the block level about how yards should be maintained in this particular block. And I also include some neighborhood characteristics, a block average of property value, and whether there's any homeowners association. And most of these items are measured on a 4 or 5 point response scale. In terms of measuring application behavior, we asked households whether they had applied fertilizer in the previous 12 months. If they had, we asked to see the bag, if they had it. about 30% of households still had a bag that they could show us. If they didn't have the bag, we asked about any information they could tell us about the product, and in many cases they could tell us it was the Scott's Weed and Feed, or there was only about 4 or 5 products that were actually used, and most of them did not vary much in terms of measurement. So we extracted as much information as we could to try to identify what was actually being applied, the size of the bag that was being applied, and then how much they were applying in any given minute. Okay, so let me first talk about the patterns of fertilizer usage behavior. We found that 56% of our sample were applying fertilizer, and this is within the range of what you find in these sorts of studies, if not on the low end. On average, those numbers tend to range between 50 and 70%. So most of the people who were applying fertilizer were using a provider to apply it, and a close minority were applying by themselves, but a handful of people were actually applying more in addition to what their provider was applying. In terms of the annual frequency, most of our households were applying between 1 and 2 times per year. You can see this skewed distribution, so I'm plotting both the mean and the median here. But around 65% of our sample was applying 2 or fewer times per year, although you can see there are a number of very heavy appliers that are falling at this end of the range. So this figure shows you the rate per application event, and it's measured in kilograms of nitrogen per hectare. And again, you can see it's significantly skewed. Our mean was around 49, median around 26. To put these numbers in context, the Agricultural Extension Agency from the University of Tennessee has an office in Nashville, and they recommend 39 kilograms per hectare. Scott's, which is the largest provider of fertilizer, recommends between 49 and 50 kilograms per hectare. So you can see our numbers are fairly close to where those professional guidelines are. Our mean, interestingly enough, fell right on top of where Scott's was. Median's a little bit lower. I mean, most of the samples a little bit lower than that, but generally within the range of what those professional guidelines are. If you look at the total amount of nitrogen applied in a year, our mean and median fell between 50 and 100. And then if you look at the professional guidelines, in this case are significantly higher than where most households are applying. So while people tend to be conforming more or less to those guidelines in terms of the rate per application, they seem to be under applying total a number of times in a year, and which is interesting. A lot of the conclusions in this literature has been that much of the nitrogen pollution that is put into the system is due to an intense over-application of households. Our data suggests that's not necessarily the case, at least if you define over and under application according to those professional guidelines. What we're finding is that most people are actually under applying, and it's really only a small subset of the sample that are over applying. We found that 15% of our sample was applying over 60% of all the nitrogen we put into the system. So the implications of this is that if you sort of operate on the assumption that it's over application that is driving this problem, and then you push these professional guidelines as a one way to deal with this problem, you may actually run the risk of driving up total nitrogen pollution. That is, you may actually get the 85% who are under applying to apply more as they follow these professional guidelines. And so the trick is really designing messaging and education that's going to be able to bring down that top 15% down without affecting the lower 85% and bringing them up. Okay, so let me talk now about the correlates of fertilizer application behavior. So the dependent variable in this analysis is whether fertilizer is applied in the last 12 months. The analysis I'm using is a two-level random intercept multi-level model. And so what this allows me to do is to deal with the nested structure of these data, which would otherwise be a violation of normal assumptions for regression analysis. And it also allows me to look simultaneously at the individual level household variables as well as those group aggregated group level variables. So in the first step of this model, I'm adding in household characteristics. And you can see a positive significant relationship between property value and home ownership. In parentheses there are the odds ratios. What that is telling you is that homeowners were about 2.5 times more likely to apply fertilizer than those who didn't own their homes. So this is not surprising. You would expect homeowners to be more likely to apply. I don't know any renter who applies fertilizer to their lawn. And that property value also was related, and likely because it just signals an economic means to engage in what is really a pretty expensive lawn care behavior. In the second step of the model, I add in these individual level variables, so lawn importance, environmental concern, communal concern, norms, and scrutiny. And here you find a significant positive relationship between lawn importance and fertilizer application. So again, not surprising. People who are really concerned about their lawn and cared about that aesthetic were significantly more likely to apply, about 1.8 more times likely to apply as you move up that lawn importance scale. You also see a significant effect of perceived neighborhood norms. So even controlling for income and lawn importance, the perception of how many others in your neighborhood who are applying fertilizer is a significant predictor of you actually also applying fertilizer. So this is consistent with much of the literature out there, but interesting, I think, and it's a finding that we've not seen in this area before. Also interesting, I think, is that there was no relationship between environmental concern and chemical concern in these behaviors. So the belief that chemicals affect you personally make you no more or less likely to apply fertilizer to your lawn than your peers who are concerned about that. And the same goes for environmental concern, which has been consistently found in the literature, at least in terms of environmental concern. This adds a new dimension by suggesting that people's concern about chemicals tends to be overwhelmed by those aesthetic preferences as well as the social dimension of lawn food behavior. And in the final block, I'm adding in the block level variables, and I don't get any significant effects from these. So all of the variants seem to be captured at the individual household level. And I do see a bivariate relationship between neighborhood standards and fertilizer usage, but once I account for property values, all the block level variance is wiped out, and it's all held within the individual household level, which is interesting, surprising to me, honestly. So the regression tables here, if anyone wants to talk more about C-specific parameters, I can show you that later. Okay, so in the second model, I'm looking at the annual programs of nitrogen applied per year among those who are self-applying. I'm going to run the same model. And in this case, there is no significant effect of these income-related variables, property value, home ownership. In the second model, now you don't see any significant effect of lawn importance. You do, interestingly, see a negative relationship between environmental concern and fertilizer application. So it seems as though even though people aren't considering their environmental interests when they're making a decision to apply it or not, it seems to be more driven by those individual concerns and your concerns about your neighbors. When they go to apply it, they're actually applying less per event, or less over the course of the year, that is. And so people are actually considering the environment when they're making these decisions. It's just, it manifests itself in ways that I don't think we necessarily expected. No effect of chemical concern. Again, you do see a positive, significant effect of neighborhood scrutiny. So the belief that other people are closely keeping an eye on your lawn means you're sort of dumping this stuff on a little bit more heavily than you otherwise would. And again, no effect of these neighborhood level factors. So again, all the variance is calculated at the individual household level. Okay, so a couple of conclusions we can make from this. I was surprised to find that all of the variation was held at the household level. I mean, obviously, one of the reasons that we chose to do the sampling design we did was because we thought that there was going to be significant block level variation. But we did not find any effective HOAs on total application, at least among those who are self-applying. But also not on the full sample and whether they applied in the last year or not. So this is surprising to me. Again, like I said just a minute ago, all of that variance was wiped out once you account for income. So the decision to apply and the intensity of application tend to correlate differently with these different individual and household predictors. Decisions to apply seem to be related to income, personal preferences, and norms within the neighborhood, whereas intensity seems to be related to environmental concerns and perceived scrutiny. And again, concern about chemicals did not affect these sorts of behaviors. So the implications of this are, I think, that policies and programs really need to be considering these social motivations for fertilizer usage. But it's just trying to convince people that they shouldn't be applying fertilizer or applying less fertilizer may not be necessarily effective if it doesn't deal with the fact that people are, in some cases, doing this because they think it's expected of them. If they don't do it, they might be violating some neighborhood code. That being said, the conclusion that has been made previously is that environmental concerns are not important in this area. That seems to be wrong. I think that environmental messaging could matter. We could appeal to people's concerns if we raise issues regarding the environmental impacts of fertilizer. It just may not manifest in preventing people from applying. It might actually manifest in reducing the amount that they apply, which still has significance for environmental outcomes. Okay, so finally let me talk a little bit about some preliminary findings regarding nitrous oxide emissions. So what we did was to take a subset of 6 of our lawns within our survey sample. And they were divided, they came from either low, middle, or high applying households. And we used a closed chamber method to measure nitrous oxide flux from the lawn. So this is a traditional method of doing this in agricultural studies. We had fashioned a chamber out of a PVC pipe. I say we, it was really not me. It's John Penn, our graduate student. So this is an anchor of the closed chamber of the chamber. And the anchor was installed on the lawn for about a year. And then twice a month, John would go out to the yard and affix this chamber over the anchor. And that would then track the emissions that are being released from the lawn. And so over the course of a 30-minute period, he would extract out with a syringe a baseline air sample and then multiple air samples over the course course of a 30-minute period to get a read on the flux of nitrous oxide. And use a gas chromatograph to measure the amount of nitrous oxide emissions in those air samples, and use the denitrification and decomposition model, the DNDC model, to actually estimate total emissions. So I should preface this by saying that we're a little bit too early in this to talk about total emissions and whether this source of emissions is significant or not. But I wanted to show you a little bit about the relationship between application behavior and emissions to sort of show you kind of how we're integrating these different skins of data. So what this graph shows you is the total nitrous oxide emissions in carbon dioxide equivalents per hectare, plotted against, and it's kind of hard to see, unfortunately, the lines here, but plotted against kilograms of nitrogen applied per hectare and the number of application events over here. And so what you can see, or at least I can point out how this is working, is that there's a relatively linear and predictable relationship between number of application events and emissions. As you increase across the number of events, you sort of get a consistent pattern of the increasing emissions. But the relationship between per application intensity and emissions is much more nonlinear. You can see this sort of steep incline as you move from around 20 kilograms per hectare to 50, and then it sort of levels off as you get above that and kind of increases more gradually. So if you look at where our sample average was in terms of application behavior, it gets you in this sort of blue low emission zone. If you look at the professional guidelines, it puts you at the top high end, more high intense emissions. So again, this is suggesting that if we are pushing these professional guidelines as one way to deal with nitrogen application impacts, we're actually likely to be pushing people on a higher zone of emissions. So again, I said we can't necessarily talk about how big this source of emissions are, but I will say that our estimates are within the range of what other studies have found. And so our preliminary conclusions are consistent with theirs, which is that we can't yet hold on to the meaningful source, but that we need to understand how some of the more ambient factors, particularly water content, is affecting this process. I also say to put these numbers in context that our preliminary estimates suggest that these emissions are much, much lower than per hectare emissions of agricultural land. So their numbers are much more highly variable and have tended to range between 100 and 8,000 kilograms per hectare. Our numbers are within the range of, say, 50 to 200. So it's likely that we're going to find that ag land really swamps the total emissions of lawn land, which is unlikely to be surprising to too many people. Okay, so in terms of where we're headed with this specific project, in the near term, our next step will be to scale up our estimates of total emissions at various different spatial scales. It includes the watershed, specifically the national area, as well as the southeast region in the United States. In addition, we wanted to begin to estimate the impact of various lawn management scenarios on these emissions. So what would different lawn management regimes do in terms of total emissions? Is there a sort of suite of behaviors that would be like the most effective and environmentally sensitive way to manage your lawn to reduce both leaching as well as nitrous oxide emissions? And that, of course, would likely include not fertilizing, but there are some other ways that we can manage this impacts, even if people aren't willing to give up the fertilization behavior itself. In the long term, I'm personally very interested in behavioral responses to outreach programs. There have been some, well, first I should say that what this means in terms of how do we handle these specific behaviors is that there's a need to both address the aesthetic preferences of households, those individualistic oriented concerns, as well as the neighborhood norms and expectations of some deconditioning these behaviors. And obviously these are two very linked issues. So we think that aesthetic preferences are deeply grounded in cultural norms and that are reinforced within these small groups. So there's some clever models that have addressed the social aspect of these sorts of behaviors. In this particular study, Werner, who was doing work out in the Salt Lake City area, she was involved in some block level interventions in which households were participating in these discussion groups that were held at churches and schools, neighborhood association meetings, and people were discussing the use of chemicals and really addressing head-on some of the beliefs and expectations that are existing within these neighborhoods. And she found significant increases in attitudes about avoiding chemicals and as well as significant increases in compliance with the program itself. In my own work, I found evidence that when messages come from a peer, it has a significantly greater impact on behavior than when those messages come from an outside third party. So this work was done in a dissertation where we looked at energy conservation behavior. You can see when the intervention started about halfway through that when these very similar environmental messages were delivered by the university as a whole, they were really not at all effective in changing behavior. When it was delivered by someone within your own department, it was significantly change the trajectory of that curve. And then finally, there's some very clever models coming out of public health, which I think have a potential role to play in environmental conservation and outreach programs. Some of you may know this work by Kelly, in which they were targeting elite members of social groups. So what they did, in this particular case, they were trying to promote safe sex practices among gay male communities. And in 4 cities across the country, they recruited the sort of socialite members of the community, the opinion leaders, the peer group leaders. And they asked them to very casually sort of promote the norm that using protected sex, using protection during sex was the appropriate behavior. This is not a very structured intervention, it's just via normal, casual, and social interactions. What they found was over the course of a 6-month or so period, that in cities that were part of the intervention, you saw a significant decline in unprotected sex and a significant increase in safe sex practices. Whereas in these control cities, they were matched control cities where no intervention took place, you saw a consistent rate across the various time periods. So I think there's some real promise in trying to, especially when you talk about lawn management, where much of those behaviors are aspirational, but there might be a role for opinion leaders as elites to play in how they shape people's norms and expectations. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, but I want to sort of end with kind of bringing it back to the rest of my research. So much of the work that I'm doing is trying to address how we can leverage behavior for environmental outcomes, and particularly how these behavioral approaches might fit into broader policy frameworks. And I think that there is a role for them to play, but I do think there's a number of things that have not really been well addressed by people within my field. That I think that, in part because they're such difficult questions to tackle, but when I think about sort of the big questions that I'd like to address in my work moving forward over the next 5 or 10 years, it sort of captures some of them. Real questions exist regarding how well can we scale up these approaches. So some of the approaches I just showed you involve very intensive, discussion-oriented, locally tailored sorts of programs. Obviously, you can't scale that up to a national level. There are ways to leverage behavior that can extract out, or I guess that's a question, are there ways to leverage behavior and extract out the qualities that make those sorts of programs effective, but to scale it up to a much more large level, or to move it into a different sort of cultural setting? And so I'm really interested in trying to understand what the underlying qualities are that could potentially be leveraged in these different sorts of intervention environments. Persistence of effects is another big one. Do we see these behaviors return to baseline as soon as we take away this intervention? What is it going to take to move behaviors into a new sort of habit or normative regime? Rebound effects is one that I mentioned I'm addressing in an early stage. So at what point are people internalizing these core environmental behaviors versus doing them out of sort of guilt, which might actually lead to moral license effects down the road? So when I sort of think about the big lingering questions, these are the ones that I really plan to be taking on, both in my work looking at core environmental behavior domestically, as well as how this fits into how we approach adaptation frameworks and policies that could facilitate more effective adaptation in developing world contexts as well. So I need to thank my collaborators, there are a number of them, they're fantastic, and I'll end there. I'm happy to take any questions.
Who were your respondents at the household level, and how did you choose them?
We asked to talk to the individual who makes most of the majority of their decisions. And so that was self-identified within the household. It was a real mix of the male and female members. In many cases, both parties said that they made those decisions, and so it was a matter of convenience which one to talk with us. In some cases, both sat down. So it is tricky to measure these individual level variables when there are more than one individual involved in those sort of decision making. And so the approach we've taken both in this work and that we're taking in our work in Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, we're also looking at household level data collection, is to have the household self-identify and really try to extract the perceptual information from the predominant respondent. And then notate on the survey that this is just one of a set of people who are making those decisions in their household. So that does leave room for some.
Did you find any interaction between the gender or education of the respondent and the...
I did not. No, I looked at, I have not looked at gender. I did look at education, and there were no interaction effects at all. And that's been reported elsewhere that not interaction with a main effect of gender. I did not even see a main effect of gender. I think once you account for income, it took care of all of that sort of variance. But no significant effects
wording was that individual perceptions about how the neighborhood thinks you should behave mattered a lot, but measures you had of the neighborhood didn't matter. So can you talk about that a little
Sure.
more? Are they entirely independent? Do you think there's an endogenous relationship? How would you measure the neighborhood?
So the benefits of using the analytical approach I took was that you can sometimes look at contextual effects that have significance above and beyond the individual's experience of those effects. So when I include perceived neighborhood, when I include the norms, I measure at the individual level, and then in addition the neighborhood standards, it would tell me whether people were responding to some cues in their environment that's above and beyond what they perceive individually about those cues. And what I'm finding is that certainly that there are these neighborhood level effects, because I can see by their relationships in them. But once you include those individual perceptions in, it seems that they're entirely filtered through the individual's sort of perspective and encountering of those
And how would you calculate the neighborhood variable?
It's an average at the block level.
Of all the individual things.
Exactly.
So it's not really containing any information that wasn't in the individual.
They were slightly different questions. So I could aggregate up the same questions I used at the household level. But in this case, I looked at the perceived norm, and then at the block level, I was looking at an agreement about how long should look in this neighborhood. So there are slightly different questions. Now, does it contain different variants? It does, because at the block level, it's telling you the relative difference of these various different blocks and these neighborhood standards. At the individual level, it's telling you how the household varies across all individuals in the sample. So it's slightly different. So at the income level, for example, I'm getting what is the typical income in the neighborhood, despite whether there might be a couple households who are well below that income standard. Does the income of the whole neighborhood matter? These neighborhoods that are the sort of more posh neighborhoods, does being a posh neighborhood matter in this analysis? It's similar to that sort of thing. Does that answer your question?
Well, I'm just thinking about what does it imply for how you might want to make interventions, right? Because your results sort of suggest that neighborhood level interventions wouldn't matter, but I don't know if that's really a correct inference.
Yeah, I don't think that's a correct inference. I think the correct inference is that these neighborhood dynamics matter very much. I think the finding that there was no variance left over at the block level after you count the individual, it doesn't change the conclusion that people's perception of what's going on in the neighborhood matters a lot. Now, one of the reasons I looked at it the way I did is because we know that in many cases the perception of what's normative is not actually what's normative. And I wanted to see if there were differences there and if we could leverage these misperceived norms as a way to change behavior. I didn't present an analysis, but I did it and looked and found that people's perception of the norms is not inaccurate. So, at the end of the day, I think the conclusion is that we should be looking at the barriers that might prevent an individual from changing their behavior because of what they perceive as typical within the neighborhood, the sort of expectation of what neighborhoods expect from them. And I think the fact that all that variance is found at the individual level does not change that conclusion.
I'm just wondering whether you presented your results back to the communities and how they viewed your findings and whether there were any
We
surprises.
haven't yet. We are going to. We're just wrapping up the analysis of the discussion. In the next, I'd say 6 months, we're going to package them into a sort of pamphlet style report and present them back. So I don't have, we do try to do that, but we don't have any information about those responses quite yet.
So in light of your findings, what do you think of adopting like the approach that has been adopted in the energy efficiency context? Old power, the smiley faces, reporting, here's your average amount of fertilizer use or amount of use, and here's the rest of your neighborhood.
Yeah.
Maybe get a smiley face if you're below. What do you think?
I think that's a viable approach. The reason why I was curious to see how accurate perceptions were, because I was thinking that that sort of approach might be truthful. So what she's talking about is O-Power shows you your energy consumption and then the energy consumption of a typical person in your neighborhood. And we find that when people are significantly higher than the typical person in the neighborhood, they tend to bring down their average consumption. On the flip side, when people are lower than their typical neighborhood, you see a rebound effect where they actually can increase their consumption, except when you reward them for the positive behavior. So in this case, I actually think that the lead of that might be in the injunctive norm, what's the desirable behavior. I saw a very close relationship between descriptive norms and injunctive norms, which is where I'm not looking at them both in this model. They were closely related, but I do think there might be a way, and this is where I think these sort of neighborhood-based approaches could be beneficial, is if the neighborhood comes together and says, this is something we value, and we care about the ecological impacts of this behavior. Neighbors like you and me
also curious to see, did you take into account for the different products they use, kind of like what's the role of a green fertilizer play in that kind of
Yeah.
situation?
I did. Yeah, so let me just, I can tell you that in terms of the nitrogen content of the various products, it was the organic fertilizers that were falling in this sort of range of the nitrogen content. Manure and organic fertilizers tended to have a much lower nitrogen content, but if people were using them, even if they were applying them 4 or 5 times a year, were not, they were much, much lower in the total nitrogen they were applying. So that could be one behavioral strategy, is to promote the use of certain kinds of fertilizer contents. The majority of people in our sample were using Scott's weed and feed and turf filler, they're like predominant. And they have nitrogen contents around 36, I think, percent. So they're quite high, they're hot, some of the highest of all the nitrogen content of fertilizers we have in our sample. And so that matters a lot, and particularly if they're applying it 4 or 5 times a year and following these guidelines, they're applying an immense amount of nitrogen to the lawn in those situations. So, yes.
So there's definitely major types of behavior change. There's sort of the how much do you apply, there's fertilizer versus no fertilizer, and then there's really big behavior change, like maybe we don't need bogs when we replant perennial grasses and native berries and things like that. So along the scope of that, how would you see your research in context of we're really trying to motivate major behavior changes?
Yeah.
How does that relate to some of the things?
Well, I'd say that when I talk about next steps and trying to figure out how different behaviors respond to outreach, one of the things I'll be attending to is the malleability of those different behaviors. I'd like to look at all of those different behaviors. I think it's unlikely in the next 10 to 15 years that we're going to see major shifts in norms about what the lawn aesthetic is. That being said, we might be able to reveal some useful models that get you there, that if we explore, 15 years to deal with the problem of significant nitrogen pollution isn't necessarily that bad. At the same time, I think we should be simultaneously looking at the smaller impact behaviors. I think there's been a misstep of some environmental policy is to only go after the really large behaviors when we could actually see more effectiveness if we targeted the smaller behaviors on a bigger scale and are acknowledging the fact that these behaviors are much more likely to be changeable. And to link back to the work I'm doing on spillover effects or rebound effects, one of the questions I have is whether adopting these small behaviors might actually lead to the adoption of bigger behaviors. What are the processes of behavior change? How do people respond psychologically to engaging in environmental behavior? Does that lead you up this sort of virtuous escalator that gets you to maybe eventually think, I don't need a lawn at all, or I could change, I could put in more natural turf grass, more natural grasses and things like that. So I guess I'd like to answer your question in a more simple way. I really want to take on the full spectrum of behaviors and not count out the small ones simply because they are small. Yes?
I have a few questions related to issues that are common with regression. So I'm wondering, when your data set is fairly small in terms of the number of observations, and did that present multiclinarity issues?
Yeah, so I did not see any problems with multiclinarity. I took a lot of time to make sure that my variables are not correlated. And some of the reasons why I specifically chose the items I chose to put in this model are because they have low correlations, particularly between the environmental concern and chemical concern items. If I ask about how concerned they would be about chemicals generally, then I begin to see those kinds of problems. But I have used principal components analysis to look for the relationships among those variables to try to reduce the effect of that.
Okay, thanks. So heteroscedasticity is common with income. So I'm wondering if you corrected standard errors for heteroscedasticity.
I did. I looked at a log transformation, and it didn't really matter in this analysis, so I preserved the original form of that variable. And this is property values. There was a significant skew to the distribution, so I can remove some of those outliers or bring those outliers down, and it didn't have any substantive impact. So ultimately what I've done is preserve the original form of the variables.
And lastly, spatial autocorrelation, right? So when you have neighborhoods like this, sometimes people think about controlling for spatial autocorrelation.
Yeah,
Did you think about that?
Right. So the analysis I presented, which uses the random intercept model, it does deal with the fact that they're nested variables. So it deals with the fact that they're intercorrelated observations within group level factors. So by including that random intercept in group level, I'm able to deal with that non-independent issue.
Okay. Thank you.
they are, because of the level of the neighborhood sections are what the lawn should look like, but also maybe because of inconsistency or consistency in your neighbor's views or your perceptions of that. And I wonder if you included the test to include variance in neighborhood perceptions or perceptions of neighborhood beliefs about what the lawn should look like.
So I'm making sure I understand, you're talking about our neighborhoods where there's a certain amount of disagreement about what the lawn should look like.
Yeah, I mean,
That's a good question. I have thought about doing that, and I have not. And I guess what you would do is include maybe a standard deviation for the neighborhood of the model.
Sure.
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. That's something I'd like to look at, but at this point I haven't looked at it. I don't really include that aggregated value. Yes.
Have you thought what effect the price of fertilizer?
Yeah, I have not. I mean, it's come up in our conversations about these data, but we have not included anything. So these data were collected over the course of 2010 and 2012. I wouldn't think the price varied much in that amount of time, but so looking at maybe price thresholds and how income levels might respond to that would be interesting. It's not something I have pursued, but.
Or maybe if they bought the fertilizer themselves or the management company applied it, there might have been a difference in the cost to them.
So the difference between self-appliers and neighborhood price, I don't think that we have anything that tells us what the average price was paid. We didn't ask that question, but I mean, it's a good question. It could shed some light onto who's doing what sort of applying the regime, for example.
Well, I'm thinking about the behavioral implications of this. I have two sorts of thoughts going in my head. One, you're saying, so the idea that the professional guidelines launch relating to the Wedge area is not a surprise, it seems to me. They're not, I'm not sure that some people are thinking about emissions at all.
Right.
Thinking about what it would take to make the Wedge be long. And it seems also that people are already using much less than what the professional guidelines would require and suggest that they should use. So there are a lot of people that are using much less. And the second thing is you're saying, that sort of external injunctions or directives don't really work. That if you have peers telling you what to do, that works much more. So what is the behavioral implication of that in terms, you sort of touched on it when you're talking about scaling up. I'm not quite sure I understand what it is.
Yeah, so what well, I think the most promising avenue are the approaches that was just referenced regarding O-Power, for example, where there may be ways to signal norms on a more widespread level without having to keep them kind of tailored to the specific block level. So a lot of times the way environmental organizations approach outreach is to talk about how bad behaviors are and we got to do better at this. I think a new messaging approach could be to suggest that, hey, a lot of people care about this. A lot of people are concerned about it, and a lot of people like you are actually changing their behavior to account for these environmental outcomes. And so an approach that addresses at least the social dimension, the fact that, it's not just me, the only one in my neighborhood that cares about the impacts of fertilizer, that there are others in my neighborhood who care about this too, but maybe we're just doing it because we think everyone else approves. Dispelling that myth could get you a little bit towards changing those behaviors that are responding to those social expectations. That's one way. A second way could be to address the sort of aspirational aspect of long-term behavior. Now, I kind of alluded to it, but I didn't really take it on head-on here. And I think, based on some of the other literature, that there's clearly that component to it. That, you find, for example, in Arizona, that households that are middle income tend to be having a certain sort of lawn aesthetic that's more green than the households that are at the upper level, the upper income levels that are more practicing more xeriscaping. And you might then begin to see some conversion based on this sort of new elite norm for how lawns are managed. I'm wondering if there are ways that we can use sort of opinion leaders within communities to try to shape those norms in more pro-environmental ways. Promoting in certain early adopting communities the use of more natural lawn aesthetics, for example. Of course, you need, to support support that with business and industry that can get you there, but that's not an easy thing. But I'm curious to see how that might trickle down through a community over time. And it could be one way to sort of scale up by narrowing the number of people you need to target and then letting the sort of normal social processes do their work in terms of diffusing those norms and expectations throughout the community.
I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about the outliers that you had in your study, if you were noticing any characteristics that sort of made them act the way they did.
Yeah, I haven't done those analysis really yet because my sample is fairly small. I will do some exploratory analysis to see kind of what's accounting for their sorts of behaviors and what sorts of neighborhood they lived in. But at this point, I really haven't done that yet. It's a good idea.
But when you are to do that precisely, so the sample is small, when you get a very large sample, the effect of outliers will be very limited.
Right. In terms of understanding who those outliers are. So
Yeah,
I've dealt with the fact that there are outliers in the data.
Yeah.
In terms of the analysis that have been removed and not removed. But in terms of understanding who those outliers are, sort of separating out and figuring out what they look like, who they are, what they're thinking about, I haven't done that in some sense.
Okay, thank you all very much. And thank Amanda by picking up an evaluation form on your way out.
Oh, really? What happened
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, no problem. How's your daughter?
Yeah, like
Unexpectedly home from the snow.
yeah, like 42
From what weather?
degrees. Like, why would you have school closure today?
Well, they got yelled at a week ago and they didn't close in Ann Arbor anyway, so. Probably
So, yeah, so really have to be and I teach a class until like now.
Yeah.
I would love to, but
It was great for breakfast. I don't know if you had a chance to meet with her. She was very,
I'm
very
going to
nice.
see her for dinner.
Yeah, great. Very nice.
Very nice talk.
Just come, 3 people. Right?
Yeah.
Bearing them is very.
Shelley. Yeah, so.
Both